What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back with the box office breakdown for March 1st, 2026. And the big news is Scream 7 has set a new franchise record, opening to $64 million in North America with an additional $33 million abroad. And before you start talking about inflation and the rise in ticket prices, I'm well aware, but this is the headline that Paramount will be pushing. And we'll do a compare and contrast with the other 6 movies in the franchise in a bit. But this news comes at a time where Paramount is already thumping its chest due to Netflix withdrawing their offer to buy Warner Brothers, meaning that pending judicial review, antitrust scrutiny, etc., Paramount will soon be the new owner of Warner Brothers, giving them many reasons to celebrate this weekend. But what makes this opening weekend even more surprising is how only a few years ago, Scream 7 nearly fell to pieces. The star Melissa Barrera, she was fired due to posts about Israel and Palestine, and then soon thereafter, Jenna Ortega bounced from the project, citing scheduling conflicts, and then the director quit because he was getting death threats over the firing of Melissa Barrera, even though it wasn't his call to fire her. But as the old expression goes, the show must go on. So Paramount hired Kevin Williamson, the original writer of the first movie in 1996, to write and direct Scream 7. And then Paramount threw down $7 million to bring back Neve Campbell, who had taken a pass on Scream 6 due to salary disputes. So for a movie that very nearly came unraveled or unglued, this monster opening weekend is an incredible outcome for Paramount. So even though the budget for Scream 7 climbed to $45 million compared to the $35 million spent on Scream 6, I think it's abundantly clear at this point that Paramount's gamble has paid off, and even if the movie has a massive second weekend drop, over the long term, this movie's going to make piles of money. Also, I'm not going to regurgitate my Scream 7 review here. However, if you're interested in my Scream 7 review, I'll leave a link in the description below, where I also talk about my love and affection for the movies of Wes Craven, as well as some other slasher movies, so enjoy if you are interested. And what's interesting is how the movie is very successful in spite of the fact that a lot of fans of Scream 5 and Scream 6 decided to boycott the latest movie due to the absence of Melissa Barrera. I guess it shows that a little bit of controversy and a little bit of boycotting helps improve the visibility or kind of like the profile of your movie, and it creates market awareness and so on and so forth. Obviously, you don't want a total boycott because then nobody will go, but a little controversy sometimes can go a long way in terms of giving you free marketing. Also, the audience for any movie franchise that's been running for 30 years is obviously going to be made up of multiple demographics. Like, you have the old fogies like myself who saw Scream back in 1996 and loved it and basically didn't give a fuck about any of the Scream movies after the fact. And then you've got the youngins out there who are obsessed with Jenna Ortega, who probably saw Scream 5 and Scream 6 and never even bothered to go back and watch the original trilogy by Wes Craven. And there are going to be a lot of people who argue that there's clearly intense nostalgia for the horror franchises of the late 90s and early 2000s. And I would say that's true about half the time, because last summer we saw Final Destination Bloodlines making an absolute killing for Warner Brothers. But for Sony, they tried to reboot or extend or whatever you want to call it. I Know What You Did Last Summer, and it was disastrous. And it's probably disastrous because that movie sucked ass, whereas Final Destination Bloodlines was actually pretty goddamn entertaining. And with Scream 7, I'd say it's the first half is entertaining, the second half runs out of gas, but basically for a movie that was kind of assembled at the last minute, like the train had left the station and Paramount was just trying to put down tracks in front of it before the train ran off, I think they can easily chalk this up as a win. But I want to compare some of the numbers of Scream 7 to some of the numbers of the previous entries in the franchise. And over on the website, the numbers, they've got a big old chart for all the previous Scream movies, going back to the first one. So once again, keep in mind that there's obviously been inflation since 1996. But the very first Scream movie, on a budget of $15 million, it only had an opening weekend of $6 million, but then word of mouth started to grow, and it became a genuine cultural phenomenon, ultimately grossing $103 million at the domestic box office and $173 million overall, which is still the highest worldwide box office for any Scream movie, and that was 30 years ago. If you adjust for inflation, it'd be way ahead of the rest of the Scream movies.
Well, I'm getting ready to watch a video.
Really? What?
Oh, just some scary movie.
You like scary movies?
Uh-huh.
You never told me your name.
Why do you want to know my name?
I want to know who I'm looking at.
And for people who weren't around the late 90s, it cannot be overstated just how influential the success of Scream was, where suddenly for like 5 years, every movie poster resembled the Scream movie poster. Every cast resembled the cast of Scream. It just, everything about that dimension style of marketing and that flavor and that tone of that movie People just kept trying to copy it over and over and over again. And I guess for someone who was 20 at that time, it all seemed very normal because all these movies were being marketed toward and directed toward a very young sensibility and a very young audience. But thanks to all the subsequent Scream movies, as well as all the other imitators out there, it did not take long before people started to get tired and weary of some of those tropes, which led to some spoof movies like Scary Movie and Not Another Teen Movie. And I would argue all the crummy like Scream knockoffs and Scream ripoffs were totally worth it in order to get us to Scary Movie and Not Another Teen Movie. But more on Scary Movie in a sec. Let's look at the rest of the numbers in the Scream franchise. So then in 1997, we had Scream 2, where the budget went up to $24 million, and we saw the opening weekend was much bigger than the opening of its predecessor. It opened to $32 million, but ultimately only ended up grossing $172 worldwide. So it wasn't quite as profitable as the earlier one, and yeah, you could already see that the kind of like the fad was starting to run its course, because I saw Scream 1 multiple times in the theater, owned the VHS, etc. and so forth. I saw Scream 2 once in the theater, and I've never gone back and watched it again. I thought it was rather forgettable. It was all hype, but very little substance, but I get it. They rushed it out to the screen in order to capitalize on the popularity of Scream. But then they waited a few years for Scream 3, which came out in 2000. The budget climbed once again to $40 million, had an opening weekend of $34 million, and then ultimately the worldwide box office started to decline down to $161 million. And then the writing was on the wall with Scream 4 in 2011. After an 11-year break, we had Scream 4. The budget stayed the same at $40 million. It opened to $18 million, so basically half of Scream 3. And then it wrapped up its worldwide run at $95 million. Obviously, a crushing defeat compared to the success of the first three movies. So then they decided to let the franchise cool off. We had yet another 11-year break, and then they returned with Scream, aka Scream 5, in 2022, where the budget was much lower. They dropped the budget down to $24 million, which was basically the budget for Scream 2 back in 1997. It opened to $30 million and ultimately ended up grossing $138 worldwide, so a little bit of improvement over its predecessor. So then Scream 6 came in 2023. I'm seeing here a budget of $33 million. I've also seen it reported at $35 million, but it had a massive opening weekend of $44 million and ultimately ended up grossing $169, which is almost as good as Scream 2 back in 1997. But once again, you got to take inflation into account. So while Scream 6 was successful, Scream 1, 2, and 3 obviously were much more successful.
You like scary movies?
What's the point? They're all the same. Some stupid killer stalking some big-breasted girl who can't act, who's always running up the stairs when she should be going out the front door. It's insulting.
Now, as far as the success of Scream 7 is concerned, the big question is it completely and totally front-loaded where the box office is going to fall off a cliff next weekend? Because the audience scores and the cinema score and everything has been much lower for Scream 7 than for Scream 6. But a lot of the critics who gave it bad reviews, they were basically giving bad reviews to how Paramount handled the whole Melissa Barrera situation as opposed to reviewing the movie itself. I really don't know, because I thought that Scream 7 was fine, but nowhere near as good as Scream. But we'll just have to wait and see. But it wouldn't surprise me at all if by the time it's finished its total international run that we'll see it up around like the 160, 170, but we'll just have to wait for week 2, week 3, etc. to know for sure. But one of the main reasons I enjoyed Scream 7 is that they very wisely played the trailer for Scary Movie 6 ahead of time, a trailer which at that time was not available online. You know what, I think it still is not available online. And it just creates an additional sense of anticipation, but also a little bit of excitement to go see Scream 7 if you're going to get to see the trailer for Scary Movie 6. Because as successful as the Scream franchise was back in the day, it doesn't compare to the success of the first Scary Movie back in 2000. Because Scary Movie, made by the Wayans brothers, was made for $19 million back in the day. It grossed $277 million worldwide, and deservedly so. I've got the first three scary movies here on Blu-ray, and the first one, I was watching it again over the weekend. It is funny as fucking shit, and it's wildly offensive and outrageous and filthy and dirty and depraved, all the things that comedies are not today. So when you watch, you're like, oh my God, like, you know, we've lost so much.
You don't look a day over 12.
Yeah.
Except for the big head and glazed over look in your eyes. Ooh, is that true?
Yeah, I forgot to swallow.
Don't worry, because I never forget.
I grew up watching Keenan Ivory Wayans and Damon Wayans and Marlon Wayans and Sean Wayans and all those guys over and over and over again. That family, they have comedy in their bones. They have comedy in their DNA. And the trailer for Scary Movie 6, I think it was the perfect way to get people excited to watch Scream 7 in the theater, because the trailer delivered. It had people screaming with laughter. And if people are already kind of like anime, like laughing and screaming are very, very like closely related emotions, it was the perfect way to kind of wake the audience up and get them ready, which probably helped carry over and help the beginning of Scream 7 seem more enjoyable. But when you look at these numbers for the Scary Movie franchise, the only one that really underperformed was Scary Movie 5, which had a budget of $20 million and ended up grossing about $78 worldwide back in 2013. But Scary Movie 2, 3, and 4, while not as successful as the original Scary Movie, were still pretty goddamn successful, as you can see in these numbers. Scary Movie 2, budget of 45, gross 141. Scary Movie 3, once again, budget of 45, gross 155, so the numbers went up. Scary Movie 4, the budget went down to $40 million, but the box office went up to $178. It was actually the second most popular Scary Movie. So the big question now is whether or not Scary Movie 6 will be as remotely funny as the original Scary Movie, because in the trailer there were 3 or 4 jokes where my audience was just screaming with laughter. But as we all know, sometimes with trailers for comedies, all the best jokes are in the trailer and then there's nothing else. But I feel like there's been so many horror trends over the last 10 years for Scary Movie to kind of catch up on and poke fun at least within the context of the trailer. It looks like they've thrown a very wide net. They're making fun of sinners. They're making fun of anything and everything under the sun. So I'll be rooting for it hard. And what would be wild to be if in 2026, if both Scream and Scary Movie have their 2 biggest successes of their respective franchises, but Scary Movie 6 will have to do extremely well to compete with the original Scary Movie. I'm still just in awe of those numbers. Budget of $19 million, box office of $277. Compare that to last year when people are having all these online debates about whether or not Thunderbolts was successful, or whether or not Fantastic Four First Steps was successful, or Superman was successful, where it's like kind of you get these like photo finish situations where suddenly everybody's going into granular detail as to whether or not the movie lost $5 or made $5, but basically have a couple of movies which underperformed and more or less broke even. A successful movie should gross like 20 times its budget. That is what got people excited about making movies back in the day, is that there was the opportunity for grotesque profits, outsized returns like we saw with the original Scary movies. So to be continued on this subject, because we'll be talking a lot more about this later on this summer when Scary Movie 6 is unleashed upon the unsuspecting public.
Hey, yo, dog. Does this shirt make me look gay?
Nah, man.
What about now?
Nah.
Cool?
But I think at this point I have blathered enough about my opinions related to the Scream franchise and Scary Movie franchise. Let's head over to Variety, where Rebecca Rubin has an article titled "Box Office: Scream 7 Sets Franchise Record with Bloody Good $64 million Debut." Ghostface still got it. Scream 7, the latest installment in Paramount and Spyglass Media's long-running slasher series, cemented a franchise record with $64.1 million in its domestic box office debut. That's a scary good start for the 30-year-old property, and one that greatly improves upon the opening of 2023's Scream 6, which previously held the domestic opening weekend benchmark with $44.4 million. Scream 7 collected another $33.1 million overseas, bringing its global tally to $97.2 million. Although this entry carries the biggest budget of the series at $45 million, it'll easily turn a profit in its theatrical run. Also, let me pause and interrupt for one more detail. At this rate, Scream will soon join the billion-dollar franchise club, because I think prior to the opening of Scream 7, it was in the low $900 million range. So very soon, if not this week, it'll be a billion-dollar franchise. So congrats to Kevin Williamson and director Wes Craven, who gave birth to this franchise back in the good old days of the crazy, naughty 90s. But back to the article. This is Sensational Business. This is David A. Gross, who runs the movie consulting firm Franchise Entertainment Research. Smashing records is always good. Scream 7 marks Paramount's first #1 release in 12 months since last March's action comedy Novocaine. The box office win after a long drought for the studio comes days after Paramount shocked Hollywood by outbidding Netflix for control of Warner Brothers Discovery. Paramount CEO David Ellison has promised the joint media behemoth would release more than 30 films a year, which would be the largest output of any studio by a wide margin. However, industry executives and theater owners are skeptical that Paramount will make good on its promise. They fear the media merger will result in fewer new films on the big screen, which could be catastrophic considering the movie theater business hasn't recovered from the pandemic and 2023 labor strikes, although revenues in 2026 are slightly ahead of last year's tally. Domestic ticket sales are down roughly 20% from pre-COVID times. And quick interruption, but it's amazing to me how in 2026 people are still bringing up the pandemic from 2020 and the labor strikes from 2023. And I want to just remind the movie biz overall, a lot of the damage from the pandemic as well as the labor strikes, a lot of the damage was largely self-inflicted. So learn to look after your own industry and help it thrive and grow with great movies coming out on a regular basis. And you can get right back to 2019 levels sooner rather than later. But getting back to the article, Scream 7 had several setbacks in the lead-up to its big screen debut, starting with the firing of 2022's Scream reboot and Scream 6 star Melissa Barrera over social media posts that Spyglass viewed as anti-Semitic. Then her co-star Jenna Ortega, as well as director Christopher Landon, departed the project. A vocal backlash, including protests at last week's premiere in Los Angeles, didn't stop fans from showing up to theaters for Scream 7 in droves. The film benefited from nostalgia. Neve Campbell, whose resilient heroine Sidney Prescott wasn't in Scream 6 due to salary disputes, returned for this entry after securing a nearly $7 million deal, as well as the enduring popularity of horror. It's remarkable that from its humble beginnings some 30 years ago, Scream would resonate as strongly today as when the first film was released. As ComScore's head of marketplace trends, Paul DeGarbedian, there's clearly an appetite for scary movies on the big screen. When you layer a terrific trailer, effective marketing campaign, and sprinkle in a dash of some of the original stars, Scream 7 was perfectly tailored for success. And let me just pause to push back a moment on the comments by Paul DeGarbedian, because obviously Scream 7 is successful, but to compare it to the original Scream 30 years ago is ridiculous, because when that movie came out, well, first and foremost, it's a really good slasher movie if you like slasher movies, but the audience response was thunderous, where people would come out of the theater, ranting and raving, screaming and talking about it, go home, grab friends or siblings or whatever, and go back to the theater for second, third, fourth helpings. I think if Scream 7 ends up making like $300 or $400 million, then you can start making those comparisons. But honestly, Scream launched a 30-year billion-dollar franchise. Scream 7 is just a box office success. But back to the article, Scream veteran Kevin Williamson directed the 7th installment, which follows a new Ghostface killer who targets Sidney Prescott's daughter. Talk about generational trauma. Critics were down on the film, while moviegoers were mixed, evidenced by the 34% on Rotten Tomatoes and B- grade on CinemaScore exit polls. Horror is known to suffer steep second weekend declines, and with these marks, Scream 7 might not be immune to pitfalls of the genre. For the young horror audience, sitting with friends in a packed dark room and being jolted by big loud scares remains a strong draw, Gross says. Since Scream 7 was this weekend's only major newcomer, holdovers, including Sony's animated Goat and the Warner Brothers adaptation of Wuthering Heights, rounded out the North American charts. Goat secured second place with $12 million, a decline of just 29% in its third weekend of release. So far, the animated family film has earned $73.9 million domestically and $130.5 million worldwide. It cost $80 million to produce. With minimal week-to-week drops, Goat seems to be enjoying a similar endurance to recent original animated films like Elemental, The Wild Robot, and Migration, all of which managed to stick around in theaters for weeks after their debuts. Third place went to Wuthering Heights with $7 million in its third outing, a 50% drop from the prior weekend. The film has generated $72.3 million in North America and a bigger than expected $119.7 million overseas for a global tally of $192 million. Warner Brothers spent $80 million to produce Wuthering Heights, not including the tens of millions for the global promotional tour. And let me pause to interrupt again. I have a feeling Wuthering Heights will more or less just about break even in its theatrical run. The big question is, will people flock to it online, on digital after the fact, or will they ignore it? Because there are a lot of people who didn't go see it because, I don't want to go see this movie because it's softcore pornography, blah, 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 blah. And I wanted to say, it's not actually that pornographic. It's very tame on that front, but it developed this reputation of being this kind of scandalous sex movie. And I was like, that is actually kind of the least remarkable quality of the movie. But I imagine a lot of those people who are protesting the change in tone and the change to the text and that sort of thing will be unable to resist checking out this forbidden movie once it's available online. And obviously, when it comes to any sort of depictions of sex, it's very subjective. What's tame for one person is really hardcore and graphic for another. If you love the novel by Emily Bronte, which I have not read, perhaps a little heavy smooching and heavy petting on the big screen seems scandalous. But for me, it's like if you're going to make I grew up in the 1980s and 1990s. Softcore porn meant something quite different, but I have a feeling that in the long term, Wuthering Heights is going to end up doing just fine for Warner Brothers. And speaking of Warner Brothers, they've got The Bride coming out later this week, which I was supposed to see last week, but my early access screening got canceled, so I'll be seeing it on Thursday instead. But just to wrap up the article, Elsewhere's Neon's concert film Epic Elvis Presley in Concert collected $3.5 million while expanding to 1,940 theaters, boosting the domestic total to $7.8 million. Director Baz Luhrmann crafted the film from never-before-seen footage of the king of rock and roll that he discovered while making the 2022 Austin Butler-led Elvis biopic. In any event, I think that's all there is to say about Scream 7 for now, but for all the youngins out there who missed the naughty 90s, go back and watch the original Scream from 1996. Kevin Williamson and Wes Craven, they made a hell of a team, and basically every single actor in that movie went on to bigger and better things, or at least more things, got a lot of work as a result. But also watch the movies of Wes Craven from the early 70s with the original Last House on the Left, which is a fucking just horrific, brutal, it is a traumatizing movie to watch. But if you want to see like a real horror movie, watch The Last House on the Left.
To avoid fainting, keep repeating. It's only a movie. Only a movie. Only a movie.
But he went on to make, like The Hills Have Eyes and A Nightmare on Elm Street and The People Under the Stairs and all sorts of really, really cool horror movies. Wes Craven was just an absolute master of his craft. But also, if you like Scream, you should watch all the movies that are being referenced in it, because in 1996, it was kind of unusual for movies to make a lot of pop cultural references. This was a pre-Joss Whedon era, and obviously Tarantino had started doing that with Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction, but it was kind of a new thing to make movie references within movies when Scream came out. But they make references to, Prom Night and Terror Train and Hellraiser and Trading Places and The Exorcist and all kinds of movies. So if you've not yet done your homework in terms of, a lot of horror classics from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, Scream will give you a bit of a roadmap of some of the essentials that you need to hunt down. But to be continued on this conversation, because Scary Movie's coming out in a few short months. Later this week, I'm seeing The Bride on Thursday, and then we start actually seeing some new movies coming out with some regularity. I'll be seeing an early access screening of Project Hail Mary the following week. Then Ready or Not comes out, and I imagine Scream 7 will get the exact right audience primed for Ready or Not 2, Here I Come, on the 19th. So who knows? Maybe the very sleepy theatrical release schedule is about to heat up, or I hope so, because this is a channel devoted to movies, and it's helpful to have new movies coming out if you have a channel devoted to movie culture. But I've also been keeping myself busy getting prepared for some Blu-ray commentary recordings that are coming up, and I'll leave a link down in the description below to my most recent Blu-ray commentary, which just came out. Let me grab it real quick. Wow. Yeah, I'm still recording. So thanks to Deaf Crocodile, who's now hired me, and Adam Rakoff and Martin Kessler for a couple different jobs. These came out recently. Hair High from director Bill Plimpton, who I used to work with as a producer on a few shorts and a few features.
Dork, you've made me mad. Not just mad, but really mad.
Two young lovers, no moon above.
And a Song of the Miraculous Hind from legendary director Marcel Yankovic. But I'll leave a link in the description below to Deaf Crocodile, where you can hunt down some of those Blu-rays. And at this point, I think I've done like 9 or 10 different Blu-ray commentaries for them. So I love working for Deaf Crocodile. They're fantastic, and hope I'll continue working with them for many years to come. But at this point, I'm off topic. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking, subscribing, hitting that notification bell. I would greatly appreciate it. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.